Welcome back to the deep dive. We often look back at the ancient world at Athens and Rome, and we tend to praise their legal systems, don't we? Roman law, Athenian democracy. They seem like these huge achievements.
They were, in many ways.
Yeah.
But today, we're not just looking at the highlights. We want to get into where those systems really started to, well, break down or show their limitations.
Exactly. Our mission today is to explore that whole evolution of justice.
hmm
How did it start in, say, classical Greece with these early attempts at holding citizens accountable?
And then how did that morph into the massive, codified, but let's be honest, often deeply corrupt imperial system we see in Rome?
Right. We're basically tracking the journey from this ideal, the rule of law, to something quite different, the rule of status.
Yeah, and we've got some fascinating sources to work with. Legal codes, historical accounts, social commentary from both Athens and Rome. It gives us a really multifaceted view.
So the goal is to pull out those key insights. How did Athens, even with all its problems, try to bring its citizens into the legal process?
And how does that contrast with Rome, where inequality was literally written into the law and corruption almost became, well, normalized, systemic?
It's about those timeless lessons, isn't it? What happens when power isn't checked, when it goes unaccountable?
That's the core of it. So where should we start? Athens.
Let's start right there, Athens, where the idea of citizens actually running the courts really began to take shape. Even before full democracy, you had the early government structure centered on the 9 archons.
Right, the College of Nine. You had the main archon, the basilisk dealing with religion and homicide, the polemarch for military stuff.
And these 9 archons, they held significant power. But the way they started their term, it was quite something. They had to take this incredible oath.
Oh, that oath. It's a fantastic piece of, well, political theater, really, and a powerful symbol. Each one swore not just to uphold the laws, but if they messed up, if they committed any injustice.
The penalty was impossible, literally impossible. They'd have to dedicate a life-size statue of themselves, made entirely of solid gold, to the city.
I mean, can you imagine? Even the richest aristocrat couldn't afford that. It wasn't about actually collecting the gold, was it?
No, of course not. It was about setting this absolute principle.
Gah.
Accountability,
Yeah.
non-negotiable, even if, the enforcement mechanism was pure hyperbole from the start.
It hammered home how seriously they, at least claimed, to view judicial integrity.
But the real engine driving Athenian democracy, the shifts weren't just about oaths and principles. They were very practical, rooted in economics and, crucially, the sea.
Absolutely. You're talking about the rise of the thetes.
The thetes, okay, let's define them. These were the lower rungs of the citizen body, right? The smaller farmers, wage earners, craftsmen.
Exactly. They were citizens, yeah, but initially without full political rights because they didn't meet the property qualifications. They couldn't afford the hoplite armor to fight in the main infantry, couldn't hold high office.
But their importance just exploded with Athens' focus on maritime trade and building a navy.
That's the key connection. Athens needed a massive fleet. The Pentaconters, the 50-oared ships, and later the famous triremes. And the wealthy elite couldn't row all those boats themselves.
So the job fell to the thetes, serving as oarsmen, as marines on these ships. Dangerous work, vital work.
And that service gave them leverage, political leverage. Our sources are pretty clear on this. Serving at sea, naval power, is fundamentally tied to the growth of Athenian democracy. Their muscle became their political voice in a way.
It makes sense. This constant need for ships and crews must have required some serious organization, too. You mentioned the Nocraria.
Ah, yes, the Nocraria. This was an early administrative system. Atticus' 4 traditional tribes were divided into 12 districts called Nocraria.
So like subdivisions of the tribes.
Sort of. Each Nocraria, the name literally means ship rulership, was almost certainly required to provide one ship for the fleet. So maybe 48 ships total in the early days, plus a couple horsemen.
So these weren't just lines on a map. They were actual committees responsible for funding and manning the Navy.
Precisely. They were mini administrative units. They collected local funds for public needs, especially naval costs. It gave lower status citizens, the ones involved locally, a taste of state administration, of managing resources, long before the big democratic reforms under Cleisthenes.
Interesting. So it was like a training ground for political participation.
In a way, yeah. It helped the Thetes show they were organized,
Yeah.
essential to the state's power. Not just, a mob, but part of the structure.
And this is happening around the same time that Athenian society itself is changing, right? Mid-7th century BC. The old aristocracy is facing a challenge.
A huge challenge. The traditional elite, the Eupatridae, based their power on birthright, on ancestry. But Athens was becoming a commercial hub. Trade was booming.
So money started talking louder than bloodlines.
Exactly. Wealth began competing with descent as the main qualification for political influence. You see this transition from pure aristocracy towards what's called a timocracy rule by wealth.
Power was initially still locked up, though, with the top archons and the Areopagus Council.
Oh, absolutely. The three chief archons were always rich nobles, and the Areopagus, the high court and council, was exclusively made up of eupatridae. They held the reins tightly.
But the pressure was building. From these smaller landowners, merchants, people getting wealthy through trade but lacking the fancy family names.
They started demanding more clarity, especially in law. They wanted written laws, not just the unwritten customs the eupatridae were interpreting, likely in their own favor.
And this pressure, this is possibly what led to the creation of the smathae, the 6 junior archons.
It seems very likely. Their title means layers down of the laws or recorders of judgments. Their job was basically to write things down, record judicial rulings, codify laws, make the legal landscape clear.
A first step towards transparency, even if the government was still basically an oligarchy.
A crucial first step. But when these laws were actually used in court, Athenian practice involved something that seems really strange to us today. Personal enmity. Extra.
Right. You didn't try to hide your grudge against the defendant, you actually highlighted it.
Yes. Prosecutors routinely brought up their pre-existing extra, their personal hostility, towards the person they were charging. To us, that sounds like admitting bias, right? Grounds for dismissing the case.
Totally. So why was it considered okay, even honorable, in Athens?
It's counterintuitive, I know. But prosecuting someone without a known personal reason, without a history of conflict, looked suspicious. It suggested you were just doing it for money or political gain.
Ah, so it was about motive. If you had extra, you had a legitimate personal reason for bringing the suit. It wasn't just random troublemaking.
Exactly. It marked you as an honorable enemy seeking justice or revenge through the proper channels, not as a sycophant, a dreaded figure in Athens, basically a vexatious litigant, an extortionist using the courts for profit.
So the courtroom becomes another venue for playing out existing conflicts, like Klaus Ebb said about war and politics, but for lawsuits.
That's a good analogy. And the example from Lysias is just perfect here.
Lysias prosecuting Eratosthenes, one of the 30 tyrants?
Yes. Eratosthenes was directly implicated in the execution of Lysias's own brother during the brief, brutal oligarchic rule of the 30. Lysias had a deeply personal, entirely understandable extra.
But he didn't just argue his personal case.
No, that's the genius of it. He masterfully blurred the lines. He took his private extra against Eratosthenes and merged it with the public enmity that the entire Athenian democracy, represented by the jury, felt towards the 30 tyrants as a whole.
So he told the jury, this isn't just about my brother, this is about us. Punishing him is part of our collective fight against tyranny.
Precisely. He enlisted the jurors as his allies in a shared cause. Their verdict wasn't just justice for Lysias, it was justice for Athens. It weaponized extra on a massive scale.
That sense of shared identity, shared honor was clearly vital. Which brings us to hubris.
Hubris, not just arrogance like we use the term today, but wanton violence, insult, acts aimed purely at humiliating someone, degrading their honor.
And this wasn't a minor legal point. Aristotle apparently categorized all of law under just 3 headings: death, damage, and hubris.
Think about that. It puts hubris on par with killing someone or destroying their property. It shows how central honor, status, and the prevention of humiliation were to the Athenian legal mindset.
What kind of acts qualified as hubris?
The sources give specific examples. Things like violently breaking into someone's home, publicly insulting female members of a family, a huge deal, coercive sexual acts, obviously, anything that degraded a citizen's sexual integrity or social standing.
So it wasn't just about physical harm, it was about the intent to shame, to diminish someone in the eyes of the community.
Exactly. An act of hubris was an attack on the social fabric itself, requiring a public legal response to restore the victim's honor and reaffirm community standards. The system was built to protect that citizen dignity.
Okay, so that's Athens. Citizen involvement growing through naval power, law becoming more transparent, but also this intense focus on personal enmity and honor in the courts. Now let's shift gears to Rome.
Right. Rome grappled with different problems, especially balancing the immense power needed for military command with the citizens' demands for clear written laws.
And that struggle led to the 12 tables, didn't it? Through the Decemvirate.
Yes, the Decemvirate, around 300 AUC, which is roughly 451-450 BC. This was born out of that classic Roman conflict, patricians versus plebeians. The plebes were demanding that the laws be written down, taken out of the exclusive control of the patrician priests and magistrates.
And the Senate eventually gave in.
They did. It was a major compromise. They agreed to suspend the normal government, the consuls, and appoint this special commission of 10 men, the Decemviri Consulari Imperio Legibus Scribundus, 10 men with consular power for writing the laws.
10 men to basically create Rome's legal foundation. And crucially, plebeians could be part of this group.
For the first time, yes. A huge symbolic step towards equality. But as you hinted, it came with a significant catch, a very Roman catch.
Power had to be absolute for this period.
Essentially, yes. To give the decemvirs the authority they needed, the Romans suspended two fundamental safeguards of citizen liberty.
Which were
The tribunate, the office of the tribunes who protected the plebeians, and the right of appeal, provocatio ad populum, the right to appeal a magistrate's capital sentence to the citizen assembly.
Wow. So to get written laws, the citizens temporarily gave up their protection from arbitrary power and their ultimate legal recourse.
Exactly. The decemvirs were bound only by an oath not to infringe sworn liberties. And history shows oaths aren't always the strongest check on power.
No kidding. And they looked outside Rome for inspiration too.
They did. An embassy was reportedly sent to Greece, maybe Athens, maybe elsewhere, specifically to study the laws of Solon and other Greek lawgivers. An admission that Rome, even then, recognized the value of external legal wisdom.
But even with written laws, Rome always seemed comfortable with concentrating immense power in emergencies, which brings us to the office of dictator.
Ah, the dictator. An office that really embodies that Roman tension between republican ideals and the need for decisive, even autocratic command in wartime.
It sounds inherently contradictory to a republic.
It was, but they saw it as a necessary evil for survival. The dictator was appointed for a specific crisis, usually military, for a limited term, typically 6 months maximum.
And his power, his imperium, trumped everyone else's, even the consuls.
Yes, the dictator's military imperium was superior. And critically, unlike the consuls, whose power was somewhat restricted inside the sacred boundary of the city, the pomerium, the dictator's full military authority extended within Rome itself.
What did that mean practically for citizens inside the city?
It meant the suspension of their most cherished right, provocatio, the right of appeal against a death sentence or severe flogging. That right did not apply against the dictator.
So the dictator could sentence a Roman citizen to death inside Rome with no appeal possible.
Correct. Within the city walls, the dictator held the power of life and death in the final instance. Civil justice was effectively suspended when facing his supreme command.
And the tribunes couldn't step in either. Their veto didn't work.
No. The intercessio, the tribunician veto, which could block the actions of almost any other magistrate, was powerless against the dictator.
So you have this legal structure designed for absolute unchecked power in a crisis. It almost seems inevitable that this comfort with concentrated power would eventually bleed into peacetime, especially later on.
And that's exactly what seems to have happened, particularly in the late Republic and early Empire. The capacity for centralized, unaccountable power became a feature, not a bug, and it festered into widespread systemic corruption, especially in the legal system.
What kinds of corruption do the sources mention?
Oh, it's a grim list. Constant complaints about abuse of the law courts, endless delays in getting justice. Justice delayed is justice denied, right? Favoritism, outright defiance of the law by the powerful. And the big one mentioned again and again, venality, bribery.
Poisoning the whole system.
Absolutely. Tacitus, writing about the early empire under Augustus, is quite cutting. He says Augustus managed to secure his own power, sure, but found absolutely no effective remedy for the violence, the political favoritism, and especially the rampant bribery infecting the courts.
So even the first emperor, consolidating all this power, couldn't clean up the mess, or maybe didn't prioritize it.
It suggests the rot was incredibly deep. It was just part of how things work. We even see jurists discussing it almost casually in legal texts.
Like it was just an expected variable.
Pretty much. There's a commentary in the Digest, the big compilation of Roman law, that discusses a hypothetical case. Someone buys something, there's a warranty against eviction, but the buyer loses the property later because the judge made a mistake or was ignorant of the law.
Okay, so judicial error.
Right. But then the commentator asks, almost rhetorically, why should it even matter how the property was lost? Was it the judge's incompetence or was it his venality, his corruption?
Wow. Equating incompetence and bribery as just two standard ways a case could go wrong.
Exactly. The implication is chilling. Both were considered equally plausible, almost routine failures of the judicial process.
And yet, amidst all this public law corruption, Roman private law, the law of contracts, property, inheritance kept developing. It became incredibly sophisticated.
It's a strange paradox, isn't it? You see it clearly in how the Roman will evolved.
How did that start? It wasn't just writing down your wishes, was it?
Not originally. The very old form was the testamentum per ausites et liberum, the will, by copper and scales. It was based on a formal legal act called mancipation, a kind of symbolic sale.
A sale. You sold your inheritance.
In a ritualistic, fictional way, yes. In front of 5 witnesses and a scale holder, livery pens, the testator would symbolically sell his estate to a trusted friend, the familiae emptor, who would then distribute it according to the testator's instructions after his death. It was cumbersome, very formal.
So not very flexible.
Not at all. That's where the praetors stepped in. Praetorian law, the law developed by magistrates responding to practical needs, started smoothing out the rough edges, recognizing less formal declarations of intent.
And eventually it became more like what we think of as a will.
Much more so.
Yeah.
By the time we get to the period just before Justinian's codification in the 6th century AD, the standard form had evolved significantly. The fictional sale was gone, but it required the seals of 7 witnesses.
7 witnesses, that's specific.
It reflects this layering of legal history. It was a blend of the old civil law formalities, the innovations of the Praetorian Edict, and rules added later by imperial constitutions. Roman jurists could create these incredibly nuanced solutions for private property.
But couldn't fix the rampant bribery in the public courts deciding people's fates.
That seems to be the tragic irony.
Which brings us squarely to the most blatant example of Roman legal inequality, the dual penalty system.
Ah, yes. If you want proof that Rome institutionalized inequality, look no further than its criminal justice system under the empire. This is where social status wasn't just a factor in sentencing. It was the entire basis of the system.
The sources talk about 2 imperial pronouncements, right? Basically 2 separate menus of punishment.
Exactly. One scale for the honestors, literally the more honorable ones, the elite, the upper classes, and a completely different, much harsher scale for the humiliores, the more humble ones, the lower classes, the vast majority of the population.
So let's break that down. What happened if you were an honestior, say a senator or a wealthy landowner, and you committed a serious crime?
Well, first off, execution capiti puneri was extremely rare for this group. Almost unheard of unless it was treason against the emperor.
So no death penalty, usually. What were the standard punishments?
Primarily exile. But even exile was carefully graded. There were 2 main forms, deportatio and relegatio.
What's the difference?
Deportatio was harsher. It usually involved being sent to a specific, often unpleasant location, like a remote island, and it meant loss of citizenship and confiscation of property. It was permanent social death.
Okay, still pretty serious. And relegatio?
Relegatio was milder. It was banishment, yes, but you generally kept your citizenship and property rights. You just had to stay away from Rome or maybe a specific province. It could be for a fixed term or for life.
So for the elite, even serious crime often meant relocation. Maybe uncomfortable, but not necessarily brutal.
Largely, yes. Look at the example of adultery under the Lex Julia de Adulteris Corricendis. For an honestier, the penalty was relegatio, usually for life, plus losing half the dowry and a third of other property. Financially painful, socially damaging, but no physical punishment.
Any other penalties for the elite?
Sure, things like modio ordining, getting kicked out of the Senate or the local town council, or being disqualified from holding public office. And a really important point, honestiors were almost always spared imprisonment before their trial. They'd typically be under house arrest or released on their own recognizance.
Okay, so that's the honorable track. Now, the grim part. What awaited the humiliores, the common folk, the poor, the laborers?
For them, the system was designed for terror and brutal deterrence. The most serious penalty category was summum supplicium, the highest penalty.
And this wasn't just execution, was it? It was aggravated forms of death.
Precisely. These were punishments reserved almost exclusively for the low status. They weren't just about ending a life. They were about public spectacle, extreme pain, and degradation.
What forms did summum supplicium take?
The sources list things like damnatio ad bestias, being thrown to wild beasts in the arena, crucifixion, the crux, being burned alive, vivus iuri, or crematio.
Just horrific. Designed to inflict maximum suffering and humiliation publicly.
Exactly. A visceral warning to the rest of the lower classes. Compare that to the honestier possibly getting a comfortable exile. The contrast is just staggering.
What about non-capital punishments for the humiliors?
Still brutal. Things like damnatio ad metellum, condemnation to the mines. This was usually a life sentence to incredibly harsh forced labor, basically a slow death sentence.
Or other forced labor.
Yes, damnatio in opus publicum, forced labor on public works projects, like quarries or roads, also incredibly harsh. And unlike the elite, humiliores faced routine physical punishment. Flogging was common.
And torture. I thought that was mainly for slaves.
Traditionally, yes. But the sources show that by the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD, during the High Empire, even freeborn Roman citizens of low status, the humiliores, were increasingly subjected to judicial torture, especially in criminal investigations. The lines blurred when it came to inflicting pain on the non-elite.
It's hard to comprehend. A legal system where the state explicitly says your social rank determines whether you live, die in agony, or get sent to an island. It's not just biased justice. It's codified, deliberate inequality.
It is. It's a system designed fundamentally to uphold the existing social hierarchy through state-sanctioned violence and terror against the lower classes.
Did anyone push back? Did any Roman thinkers or jurists question this?
There were glimmers. We see some early forms of what we might call rex critique, critical thinking, about the law emerging among the jurists.
How so?
Well, they started questioning the extreme harshness, the sevitia of some ancient laws. For example, the Law of the 12 Tables, the very foundation, apparently prescribed enslavement as the penalty for furtum manifestum, being caught red-handed while stealing.
Enslavement for theft, that's severe.
It was considered a poena capitalis, a penalty affecting your civic status or life. Later Roman jurists looked back at this and criticized it as excessively harsh, especially for relatively minor theft.
And did they change it?
Eventually, yes. The penalty for manifest theft was changed to a monetary one, usually 4 times the value of the stolen item. So they were capable of seeing an old law as too brutal and reforming it.
Okay, so some progress there.
Yeah.
Applying critical thought to historical punishments.
Yes, but, and it's big, this critique seems mostly focused on older laws, often related to property or specific procedures. It didn't really challenge the fundamental ongoing injustice of the contemporary dual penalty system itself.
So they might question enslavement for theft from the 5th century BC.
But not necessarily the routine crucifixion or burning alive of low-status citizens for crimes in the 2nd century AD. That was just accepted as how the empire worked.
Yeah.
The Rex critique was still in its infancy when it came to challenging the core systemic inequalities of their own time.
So the system remained brutally stratified, largely unchallenged from within. And who sat at the very top of this whole structure?
The emperor, of course. The transition from republic to empire was fundamentally about concentrating all forms of power, military, legal, political, into one person's hands.
And Augustus achieved this partly through the tribunicia potestas, the power of the tribune.
That was a masterstroke. By taking on the powers associated with the tribunes of the plebs, their personal sacrosanctity, their veto power intercessio, their right to convene the Senate and Assemblies Augustus and subsequent emperors, effectively placed themselves above the traditional checks and balances.
Even though they weren't plebeians themselves.
Exactly. It gave them a legal basis to intervene anywhere, to override anyone, all while maintaining the facade of republican legality.
And this meant provincial governors, the proconsuls who once wielded considerable independent power,
became in practice just legates of the emperor. Their authority derived from him, their decisions could be appealed to him, his final word was absolute.
So absolute that he ended up ruling on everything, even minor civil stuff.
It seems so. There's that telling anecdote about Julius Caesar even before he was formally emperor, but wielding immense power. He was apparently called on to make a ruling confirming someone's inheritance.
A private inheritance. Why Caesar?
Exactly. The person who died hadn't done anything wrong politically. It was just a standard civil law matter. But the fact that Caesar's confirmation was sought, or perhaps needed, shows how the ultimate power over life and death inevitably drew even purely private matters into its orbit. If you could condemn someone, you could also validate their will.
Total power requires total reach.
Precisely. And to run this enormous centralized state, the empire needed money, lots of it, which led to the monetization of public life. We can actually see precursors to this back in Athens.
You mean the liturgies?
Yes, the liturgies. These weren't voluntary donations. They were compulsory public services funded out of pocket by the wealthiest citizens.
Right. It wasn't charity. It was an obligation that came with being rich.
Absolutely. The most famous was the triarchy. the duty to command, equip, and maintain a warship, a trireme, for a full year.
Right.
This was hugely expensive.
And it caused problems.
Oh, definitely. It led to constant disputes. Wealthy citizens trying to dodge the duty, arguments over who was liable next, lawsuits to recover expensive naval gear from previous triarchs who hadn't returned it properly. Being wealthy in Athens meant you were constantly on the hook financially for the state's needs.
So wealth itself was a kind of public service obligation.
In a very direct way.
Yeah.
And the Romans took this concept, and especially in the later empire, turned it into the system of munera.
Also called liturgies, but the Roman version.
Right. These were the non-military, non-elected duties imposed by the state on the local elites, the decurions or town councilors, in the cities throughout the empire.
What kind of duties?
Funding public buildings, maintaining roads and aqueducts, providing grain supplies, entertainment, and crucially, collecting imperial taxes for their district.
Wait, they had to collect the taxes?
Yes, and they were personally liable for any shortfall. If the tax revenue wasn't enough, the decurions had to make up the difference from their own pockets.
That's brutal. It's basically outsourcing the state's financial risk onto the local wealthy class.
It was. It became an incredibly crushing burden, often leading to the financial ruin of these local elites. Many tried to flee or hide their wealth to avoid being forced into the council. It was a system built on financial coercion, a far cry from the perhaps burdensome but more civic-minded Athenian liturgy.
Given this whole system, stratified justice, centralized power, monetized public service, rampant bribery, it's fascinating to see how the Romans dealt with payment for intellectual work, particularly legal knowledge.
It's one of the most striking contradictions, isn't it?
Yeah.
We see that provincial governors had the authority to regulate salaries and fees for certain professions deemed liberal pursuits.
Like who?
Rhetoricians, teachers of public speaking, grammarians, language teachers, geometers, doctors, people whose skills were valued and necessary. The governor could step in and settle disputes about their pay.
Okay, seems reasonable, but there was a major exception.
A huge one. Governors were specifically instructed not to hear cases involving payment disputes for two particular groups, teachers of civil law and philosophers.
Wait, they could set the salary for a math teacher, but not for the person teaching the very laws of Rome, or someone teaching philosophy. Why on earth not?
The official reasoning, as recorded in the legal sources, is pure, high-minded idealism. Knowledge of civil law and philosophy was considered not to be valued in terms of money.
Seriously.
Seriously. It was seen as something hallowed, something sacred. To sue for a fee for teaching the law or philosophy would be to dishonor that knowledge by treating it like a common commodity. Payment should only be offered voluntarily as a gesture of gratitude, an honorarium.
That sounds completely detached from reality, especially in a system drowning in venality everywhere else, like a little island of Socratic idealism in a sea of Roman pragmatism and corruption.
It is quite jarring, this idea that the foundational knowledge of the state's legal system is too pure to have a price tag.
But they still needed lawyers, advocates to actually argue cases in those corrupt courts, right? And they got paid.
Yes. The idealism stopped abruptly when it came to the practical application of law. Advocates' fees were very much a thing, and they were regulated.
How?
The judge handling a case was actually required to determine the appropriate fee for the advocates involved. They had to consider the complexity of the case, the skill demonstrated by the advocate, the custom of that particular court.
So market rates, basically, but with judicial oversight.
Exactly. And there was a ceiling. The fee set by the judge could not exceed a maximum amount that was established by imperial rescript, a direct decree from the emperor.
So the emperor himself is setting the maximum price for legal representation.
Yes. The state fully acknowledged that arguing in court was a paid service, a profession with regulated fees, while simultaneously maintaining this fiction that the underlying knowledge of the law itself was priceless and sacred.
That's quite the tightrope walk. Idealism for the teachers, regulated market for the practitioners.
It perfectly captures the Roman blend of high principle and, let's say, practical necessity.
So, looking back over this whole journey, from Athens to Rome, what's the big picture?
Well, you see this clear trajectory, don't you? Athens, driven by its unique circumstances like naval power, creates space for broader citizen participation, even for the lower classes like the Thetes. It develops legal ways to manage conflict, like acknowledging extra, and puts huge emphasis on citizen honor with concepts like hubris. It's messy, conflict-ridden, but striving towards some kind of civic inclusion.
And then Rome.
Rome builds this incredibly durable, massive legal and political structure. But over time, stability seems to come at the cost of equality. Power becomes more concentrated, corruption becomes more systemic, and justice itself gets formally stratified. The dual penalty system is the ultimate symbol of that your legal fate explicitly depends on your social class, your label as honest juror or humilior.
The journey from a system managing conflict between relative equals, however rough, to a system enforcing hierarchy through unequal application of law.
Right. In imperial Rome, justice wasn't just blind. It had its eyes wide open, checking your social status before deciding your punishment. It was often delayed, often for sale, and always administered with that explicit class bias.
It makes you think about those classical ideals. Socrates arguing that doing well, Cratiston, comes purely from knowledge and being attentive, that it's the opposite of just being lucky.
Yeah, that strong assertion of intellectual meritocracy. Knowledge and application determine success, not chance. You master a skill, you pay attention, you succeed.
But then you crash against that other ancient observation, that wisdom, Sophia, doesn't guarantee anything in the real world. Smart, wise people have ended up enslaved, miserable, losing everything. Knowledge doesn't automatically grant you political freedom or power.
And that's the tension we see played out historically. Critical thinking was valued. You see it in Athens with jurors weighing hubris. You see glimpses in Rome with jurists questioning ancient harsh laws. But the hard reality, the historical record, shows that entrenched power structures, codified status, systemic corruption, these things often just steamroll merit and objective justice.
Which brings us back to that fascinating Roman contradiction about paying for legal knowledge,
That idea that teaching civil law is hallowed, too pure for money.
while simultaneously needing imperial decrees to cap the fees of the advocates actually using that law in the grubby reality of the courts.
They desperately wanted to keep this ideal of pure knowledge separate from the world of commerce and influence peddling. But the boundary just couldn't hold.
So maybe a final thought for you, our listeners, to ponder. Think
Yeah.
about our own world today. Where do we see similar attempts to fence off certain kinds of knowledge or professional services, maybe in law, medicine, science, higher education, as being somehow above the market, maybe hallowed or driven purely by ethics or the pursuit of truth?
And where, in reality, do those fences break down? Where does the need for funding, the influence of money, the power of status or government regulation inevitably shape how that knowledge is created, accessed, and applied?
What does that ongoing tension tell us about who really controls access to justice or health or knowledge itself, and whether power and status still, perhaps subtly, shape outcomes despite our ideals of equality?
That fundamental conflict between the ideal of pure knowledge or service and the practical realities of power, money, and status. It's been with us since that first Athenian archon swore he could pay for injustice with an impossible gold statue. It seems it's still with us today.
Indeed. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. We hope it's given you some food for thought. We'll be back soon with another exploration.